Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Glad you could join us today for this webinar on discovering the value of your nonprofit IT budget. Let me introduce myself first before we get into the webinar. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the CEO at Community IT. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Community IT is a 100% employee-owned managed services provider that works exclusively with nonprofit organizations. Our mission, the reason that we exist, is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. Does your organization have a strategic plan or an organizational plan? Or I know these aren't all the same things, but a big picture plan that involves the whole organization, I should put it that way.
Wonderful. It looks like 82% said, yes, we have a strategic plan that is updated every 3 to 4 years, and 18% said we have an informal plan.
Great, that's great. Having a plan is important, whether it's a formal plan that the organization has a formal process to update on a regular basis, or even just an informal plan. Having some tie-in to the rest of the organization is really important and very helpful for the budgeting process. So you want to look at the strategic plan as you're putting together your budget. Make sure that the IT initiatives that you're looking at are delivering services that the organization is going to need as part of its strategic plan. So an organization might decide that it's starting to collect digital media. You know, there might be a new program that's gathering a lot of videos or a lot of photos. Where is all that going to be stored? So that's something that makes its way into the IT budget. Even little things like that. Obviously, newer closing programs or initiatives can also affect staff size, and that can have a big impact on an IT budget. So knowing if the organization is growing in the coming year or shrinking, those will have a big impact on the IT budget, as well as opening and closing sites and locations. Many organizations now are starting to rethink how they're going to operate moving forward because of the pandemic. So is your organization going to return to working in an office, or is it looking at closing the office and just having everybody work remotely? That's going to have a huge impact on IT and IT budgeting. So it's important to understand that. And then finally, any leadership transitions that might be in place or planned for the organization, those can also affect the IT budget. Funding changes or requirements. If the organization is going to be going after federal grants, for example, federal grants have specific security and compliance requirements that the organization may not have dealt with in the past. A big one that people often think about is HIPAA, which is for health information. And if your organization is not used to dealing with HIPAA compliance, but they're going to get a grant that has the organization working with health information, patient data, you're going to need to start thinking about how you're going to manage the HIPAA compliance. So talking to the program areas and understanding what they're going after in the coming year or coming years, if possible, can have a big impact on the budget. All right, so now that you've done the assessment, the preparation, the first step in this whole process was preparation, and obviously spent a lot of time talking about that because it's so important. Once you've done that, then you can start to draft your budget. You can put a draft budget together, and this might look different for different organizations, but I have a few suggestions or tips on things you can do when you're putting together a draft budget. Before we do that, just curious, what describes IT at your organization? Are you completely in-house? Do you rely on a third-party provider? Or do you have a hybrid, or we call it co-managed environment, where you have an IT team, and that IT team is working with a third-party provider?
Looks like 26% said we are completely in-house, 42% said we rely on a third-party provider, and 32% said our in-house IT team works with a third party.
Great. Well, another even split. That seems to be our trend here with the polls, almost breaking down a third, a third, a third. So great. So here's some ways you can think about drafting your budget. This is pretty obvious. A lot of nonprofits pay very close attention to the difference between capital expenses and operating expenses, and what you can capitalize can make a big difference. Capital expenses oftentimes can be easier to get funding for. Operating expenses often are considered part of overhead and need to be kept to a minimum. So just understanding this distinction as you're putting together the IT budget is very critical, maybe even more so than in for-profit situations. We tend to think of capital expenditures as basically being projects, large implementations, big expenditures of hardware, for example, and then the ongoing support tends to fall under operating. So the first area is personnel. So you want to make sure, and this tends to be ongoing, although if you're doing a big project, I talked about HIPAA compliance earlier. If you need to hire a third-party HIPAA compliance expert to assist with that process, for example, that might fall under projects. So it's important when you're putting together the budget to include fully loaded staff costs. And this will vary from organization to organization. Some organizations don't segment out their staff costs into different departments. It may just be categorized somewhere else in the organization. But if IT is expected to carry its own staff costs in its budget, make sure you understand, if those are fully loaded and what the loading value is. If you have any third-party service providers, make sure that those are included in the budget. This can actually be a tricky area because in some cases, like a managed services provider, for example, is clearly part of IT, but a web developer, is that part of IT? Is that part of communications? It can really vary. And in fact, it can vary it can be even more granular than that, where maybe the organization's main website is managed by one website consultant that's part of IT, but then there's a special website that's being rolled out for a special program, and that may be a program expense, or it could be a communications expense. So just understanding all of the different third-party service providers that touch on IT and where exactly their costs go is an important part of drafting the budget. Make sure that it's not missing, essentially. Third-party service providers, and then any external consultants, individual consultants that you may be working with in IT. Then the next one, so the first area to put in your draft budget is personnel. The next is hardware, workstations. I don't know if I needed to emphasize that 3 times. It seems to be more of a priority for people these days than it was 3 or 4 years ago. But I can't overemphasize, if your staff are working on old, out-of-date workstations, they're not working. They're just frustrated, and it's going to be very slow and painful and difficult for them to get anything done. So workstations are expensive. Unfortunately, laptops in particular can be expensive, but you have to invest in keeping those updated every year. We are now at the point where we recommend replacing laptops every 3 years. And the best way to do that is to replace a third of all the workstations, a third of all laptops every year. So that should be a standing item in the budget. And if it's not, we'd recommend moving to a place where it is, where the organization just understands that, okay, every year I'm replacing a third of all the workstations. That doesn't include workstations that are needed for potential growth. So if the organization is adding new programs, new locations, new staff, that needs to be in the budget as well. So can't emphasize that enough. You have to have working workstations. And we've seen over and over again cases where organizations, they finally got a grant. I'm not trying to downplay the challenges of funding IT as a nonprofit organization. So that's not at all. I'm just trying to emphasize the value of having good hardware. And we had a client who they finally got a grant. They were able to replace the workstations, and the number of tickets that were coming into the help desk went down by a third. I'm sorry, by 2/3 to a third of what it had been originally. 2/3 of all the problems that staff were experiencing disappeared when they updated their workstations. So it's really important. We've seen it over and over again. And if you can get it approved in the budget, we strongly encourage advocating for it. This is becoming less and less of an issue because most people have moved a lot of their information out to the cloud, although there's still a fair number of legacy systems that still reside on servers. So what we're finding now is if you have less than 100 staff, you may only have 1 or 2 servers. If you have more than 100 staff, you may have anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen servers. It's important to make sure you know when those servers expire. We typically recommend replacing servers every 5 years, and you need to replace virtual as well as physical servers. Obviously, the hardware on physical servers ages and needs to be replaced, but the operating system on virtual servers also ages, and we've also learned that they typically need to be replaced every 5 years as well with the latest version of the operating system. And also honestly, there's this digital dust that sort of gathers in old operating systems. They just don't work as well. So we should have budget for both virtual and physical. And then I talked earlier about network equipment, like your firewall, wireless equipment, network switches, that's important. Audio visual is something that it's sort of ancillary to IT, but typically ends up being one of IT's responsibilities. And that's typically conference room technology. So televisions and other displays, the audio system, the camera system, those also need to be included. And then finally, printers. We recommend going with a service for printers. I mean, you can buy desktop printers for individual staff like HR that need their own printer, but for the organization as a whole, we found you're just much better off leasing a printer from a printer service. And they basically, then it just becomes an annual cost, and they handle replacing the printer on a regular basis. So that's hardware. You want to have a section in your budget for software. We've already talked about this at some length, but you might have some legacy on-premise systems still, like Razor's Edge, some older financial accounting packages. A lot of organizations still use QuickBooks, or they might have a program that uses QuickBooks, or they might be working with a partner that uses QuickBooks. And QuickBooks, it has an online version, but it's pretty different from the desktop or server-based version. So you might need to continue to support that legacy. So legacy is fine. I think there's sometimes people feel like, oh, I wish we just get rid of all these. And oftentimes the legacy systems match up really well with the organization's business processes. And it just becomes challenging. You just have to change too many things in the business process side to abandon the legacy system. So there can be good business reasons for keeping legacy information systems, but then there's sort of a cascade of impact with that where you have to support it through sort of legacy on-premise infrastructure. So that's something to keep in mind as you're putting the budget together. You want to make sure that all of your software as a service or SaaS licensed applications, this is actual software that's installed on the desktop, like your Office suite with Word and Excel. You can still buy licenses, volume licenses to run that software, but in general, you're probably going to be purchasing it as a subscription. So you want to have that in the budget as well. Adobe has moved almost completely to a subscription-based service. particularly for their Creative Cloud. So that's another category of software that you can categorize in your budget. And then finally, your software as a service applications. These live in the cloud. They're basically cloud-based services. Office 365 is one of the most common. Google Workspace also. Google Workspace is pretty much free for nonprofits. Office 365, very complicated, lots of licensing. When you're doing your budgeting, you'll want to go into your Office 365 tenant as a global administrator and go into the payment section and figure out what all the different licenses you have, what you're paying for them. You want to understand that as you go into budgeting season. So that's really important. Zoom obviously is very now common, almost ubiquitous software as a service solution. Salesforce is one that more nonprofits are using. If you have a ticketing system, for example. Another one that's really important is Google Analytics and Google AdWords. Google AdWords does provide a grant for nonprofit organizations, but depending on what your communications team is doing with it, they might be exceeding the grant. So that's another area. The Google Analytics and AdWords sort of falls into the same category as web developers, where you want to make sure you're in close contact with the communications department to understand whose responsibility is that. So that's software. The fourth category in your budget. So the first one's personnel, the second's hardware, the third is software, the fourth are services. So your internet connection, your telephony service, your printers, backup, your various security solutions like antivirus, threat protection, spam and content filtering. And then some of the ones that often get forgotten are hardware recycling and data destruction. That's going to cost money. We recommend that when laptops and servers in particular are recycled, that you pay for the data destruction of the hardware. So make sure that's in the budget as well. Typically, hardware recyclers will take the hardware, at least they still do, at no cost. They will charge for destroying the data. They will often charge for monitors because those are more expensive to recycle responsibly. So make sure you understand what those costs are. There can be additional costs related to the website, such as not just the hosting costs, but also the security certificates that might be associated with your website. So make sure you understand those as well. All right, so the last section here, now that we've got a draft budget, the last section is to, remember I'd said, make sure you put that draft budget together, get everything in there, ask for the moon, put everything you need, everything I've talked about, put that in your draft budget. You might not be able to just submit that as a draft budget for budget approval, although it doesn't hurt. I mean, I always like to let the organization know these are all the things that you really need to do. Maybe you can't do everything this year, but this really becomes like a 2 or 3 year technology plan for the organization. But you're gonna have to prioritize. So you're gonna have to take the list of budgeted items that you've put together and then identify what's the top priority. Basically, you have to order it from top priority to lowest priority. And then depending on your organization, you might have to sort of cut off, okay, well, here's what I'm gonna submit. And then the rest of it, I'll just keep it in my pocket. I'll have it handy in case a grant comes in or in case, we're able to increase the budget request. So this is our last poll. Thank you all so much for staying with us today on this webinar. Got a little bit more talk about prioritization, but before we get there, curious, how effectively does your organization prioritize IT initiatives? Do you have a prioritized list of IT initiatives? Do you make critical issues a priority when they arise, or are you struggling with prioritizing IT investments?
We will go ahead and close the poll in about 5 seconds. So if you have not voted, please go ahead and do so now. And it looks like we have 44% said we have a prioritized list of IT initiatives, 33% said we make critical issues a priority when they arise, and 22% said we do not prioritize IT investments in any way.
All right, not quite the third that we've been seeing. Almost half have a prioritized list of IT initiatives, so that's great to hear. And then also a third prioritizing issues as they arise, which is also great. It's great to prioritize in advance, but as long as you're prioritizing at some point along the way, that's really helpful. So let me just talk quickly about some suggestions on how to prioritize. As I mentioned earlier, hardware is so critical. So typically prioritize that first. I mean, new initiatives are important, but if you're buying, I mean, I've seen this happen where you're buying new software and trying to roll it out, and it's being rolled out on ancient hardware, the internet connection's failing, the machines aren't working for staff, it's going to be an uphill battle. So in order for new initiatives to be successful, the hardware has to be refreshed first. And then also existing licenses, you have to budget for, you know, keeping those licenses. That's sort of like keeping the lights on, you know, that's just paying the utility bill basically. So and then from there you would budget new initiatives. And then on the hardware side, I would start with networking. This isn't quite as important here in this COVID pandemic era, but network switches, which no one ever sees, no one ever knows what they are, what they do, they live in the closet. When those start to fail, they drive everybody crazy because they fail in very strange ways, and people will be working on something and then suddenly it'll stop working and they won't know what to do, and it affects lots of people in the organization. So the networking, that hardware that keeps all of the machines networked together and connected to the internet, and the internet connection itself, that has to come first, because if you can't get on the internet and if you can't communicate with other machines on the network, you're not going to get anything done. So that's number one. Number two, servers and cloud investments, because they affect large percentage of staff in the organization. So that's very important. Once that's been invested in, because you can limp along, as much as I've been sort of harping on the need for new workstations and keeping those modernized, you know, some subset of staff can kind of limp along on older workstations. But if you have old networking equipment and you're not keeping your server and cloud infrastructure up to date, it's going to affect everybody in the organization. So again, I mean, this is, you know, we're talking about prioritizing here. It'd be great if you could do all of these things, but if you have to make cuts, if you have to make concessions, that's the place to do it. Backup, the reason it's so high in the stack, you know, you think, oh, we have to back up our data. Yes, it's true, but you have to do the work to create the data in the first place. And then also, you don't have to invest in a state-of-the-art backup solution. And that's where knowing what the business continuity requirements of the organization are so important, because the more, you know, if you can sort of say, well, you know, this data, we need to get it back, but it can take a couple of days to get it back. This data has to be available at all times. That can really save a lot of money, being able to kind of segment out the business continuity requirements for different types of data in the organization. And then finally, our CTO would kill me if he saw me putting security at the top of the pyramid and not at the bottom. But security is very important. You have to have security in place. I talked about that at some length earlier in the webinar as well. So that's the, this is just some general tips on how to prioritize. Obviously, prioritizing in more detail is something that is going to be unique to each specific organization. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. We've talked about IT budgeting as a process. We talked about how you can prepare for that budgeting process by assessing the organization's IT readiness, looking at the previous budgets, and looking at organizational plans such as business plans or strategic plans. We talked about how you can draft your budget, put together a draft budget, consider the difference between capital and operating expenses. dividing the IT expenses into 4 categories: personnel, hardware, software, and services, and then touched briefly on some ways that you can prioritize those expenditures. So I hope you were able to understand in more detail the budgeting process that can lead to an IT budget, some of the ways that you can connect organizational goals to IT through the budgeting process, and the basic outline of how to evaluate your existing technology. So we only have a few minutes left, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Awesome. Yeah, we did have some questions come in. So this is the first one. It says, what suggestions do you have for online forums or community for asking questions or getting updates about various IT topics and issues?
Great. Yeah, I think N10, the nonprofit, well, I guess they just go by N10 now, n10.org is a great resource. They have a great forum. A lot of some vendors, but a lot of IT professionals are on that forum. So I'd just go to n10.org. Nonprofit Learning Lab is a great resource and has a lot of great information. And then also TechSoup, well known for their software donation program, but they also have a lot of posts and education. So those are some of the resources that I would look to first.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This next question says, what are you seeing in terms of innovations in nonprofits using technology items outside of the content of your assessment and approaches to budgeting for those IT innovations?
That's a great question. I think I typically try to encourage nonprofits to just focus primarily on their organizational needs, and then let IT innovation kind of flow out of that. So not to worry too much about innovative things that are happening in the world of IT. I do think that working with an external IT support provider can be, someone who's working in IT on a regular basis can be a good way to keep you connected to IT innovation. So a good example of that is Microsoft has this solution called Autopilot, and I won't go into the details, but basically through Autopilot, you can set it up so that you can order a computer directly from Dell, have it shipped to your staff wherever they are, and it's basically set up and when they log in, it's connected to your domain, and it starts to install the software that they need. So that's an IT innovation from Microsoft. It's pretty technical, but it can save a lot of time in setting up computers. And I think that's one where just working with a Microsoft partner would help make you aware of that particular innovation.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. All right, next question says, I was thinking about a 3-year life cycle. Does having better hardware like solid state hard drives, plenty of memory, and a really good processor make a difference?
Yes, I mean, I think you want to go with you don't want to go with bare minimum specs on the hardware. You want to go with sort of, I would say, generally middle of the road specs. So for laptops right now, go with 16 gigs of RAM rather than 8. I wouldn't get 24, anticipating that you might need more down the road. I would just go with middle of the road specs right now. Part of the reason that we recommend a 3-year hardware replacement cycle is due to wear and tear. So it's partly that the machine ages, but it's also based on the wear and tear that the computer gets, and that varies based on who the computer is assigned to. So sometimes you can get away with using laptops for 4 or 5 years, but generally that has more to do with how hard the person using the computer has been on it, as opposed to the specs that you first order it with. I think the one caveat or additional consideration there is if you have staff that are doing a lot of research, or you have staff that are doing a lot of graphic design or video editing, then you want to go with a higher end machine, just so that they can do the work that they're doing now.
Wonderful. All right, next question. How do you suggest we handle budgeting for larger purchases with time-saving components? Automation, moves management software. These might cost a lot, but save a staff time. How to balance?
Yeah, in terms of, productivity gains can be used to justify IT expenditures. I always like to frame it in terms of the value that it'll deliver to the organization. And I think productivity gains, is one form of value, but like moves management software, for example, delivers other forms of value in terms of, generating more fundraising, for the organization. So I think, and that's where knowing what the organization's larger business plan or strategic plan is, you can basically connect um, the purpose of that software solution or a large capital expenditure. If you can tie that in to some organizational initiative that the organization is committed to and demonstrate how that IT initiative is going to generate value or create value for the organization as a whole, I tend to find that argument to be a little bit more persuasive to senior leadership than the productivity gains argument. I think productivity gains are important, and definitely if you have sort of a transformative technology that you're implementing that's going to take someone away from doing something very, laboriously or manually, in Excel or something like that, into a new solution, you definitely want to mention that. But then oftentimes they're able to do things that there's just no way for them to do right now in the manual approach. And that creates new value for the organization. And I think that's the thing to really emphasize.
Awesome. And then the last question is just a clarification about one of the forums you had mentioned. If you could spell it out, it was Intim.
Oh, sure. Let me chat it out, actually.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, and while you do that, I'm just going to take this time to remind everyone that we will be sending out a recording and a copy of the slides to all of you tomorrow. So keep an eye on your email for that. And thank you so much for joining us. And then Johan, thank you for taking the time out of your day to come on here and have this wonderful conversation with our attendees. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone learned as much as I did.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Everyone have a great week, and we'll see you at our next webinar.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.